didn't go. Because in general, as they deliberated about it, the American founders realized that there had to be a certain level of expertise. There had to be a certain amount of time in office before a person could actually even do his or her job in that position. But still, in the U.S. House, they're elected every 2 years. There's a 2-year, every 2 years we get to decide. In the Senate, every 6 years, and the Senate was designed with the idea that will be the body that more or less is more of the intellectual elite, the people who actually can see the bigger picture, more likely to slow down the responsiveness of the people. So they understood that some of these ideas were too radical in the long run, but still, and the Bill of Rights itself reflects the fear that the early Americans had about their government, that they, at least some of them, demanded guarantees that their individual freedoms and rights would not be infringed upon. Okay? Well, so I don't know if you're surprised by their view of human nature, but I say their view of human nature was more Machiavelli's view than Aristotle's view. And to sort of illustrate that further, I like to quote James Madison's Federalist 51. It's one of the Federalist papers that he wrote to promote the new Constitution to be ratified. And he's talking about human nature here and why it is that we have to divide up the power into different offices. Why we can't just have it all in even one legislative body. We can't have it in just an executive. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then, in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Okay? And so, he assumes, by saying this, that when you put a person into a position of authority, that their self-interest is going to be intimately connected with that position. They aren't going to sit there and say, what's the good of all mankind, or what's the good of all the citizens? They're going to think about, how can I stay here? And how can I improve, therefore, my chances of being re-elected? And how do I please my particular constituency? Maybe even, how can I make myself more powerful, influential, and wealthy? And they expected people, they counted upon people having these thoughts. So that if you divide the power and you pit the branches against each other, the way the American Constitution does, you can harness that self-interest in a useful way. Ambition is made to counteract ambition. So the self-interest of the various people compete with each other. And that, to a large extent, they thought, would neutralize the excessive power of government. Okay? Would stop it from becoming too powerful. Okay? Now, isn't that interesting when you think about it? I mean, we all, anybody born and raised here anyway would know that generally that's the division of power. That's a separation of powers and checks and balances idea, right? But have you really ever thought about what the founders assumed of human nature in order to set up government that way? Now, they weren't saying that you will never have a virtuous leader that can transcend his own self-interest. They're just saying we don't want to build a government assuming that's the case. We want to build a government that assumes self-interest, because that's going to happen a lot of the time.
I'm sure I can remember this one now, but it was like you said, realist thought, that frame of thought.
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle was that idealist, we talked about it.
Exactly. Right. That sort of recalls what we discussed in 301. The American founders turn out to be pretty realistic. Yeah. I mean, they have their idealistic moments in their speeches and writings, but for the most part, they have realist assumptions. Yep. And you know, that, again, I don't want to sound too cynical, because they did greatly admire nobility of purpose. They themselves were oftentimes very noble people. They were people who were thinking about the future of their country. Okay? So they knew that people could transcend pure self-interest sometimes. But did you want to make a constitution that relied upon nobility of purpose? You know, not knowing that what the times hold ahead, not knowing what type of people will be there a generation from now or 2 generations from now. You want to guard against the tendency of many people to abuse their power. So this is the way that they tried to do that. Okay. So notice then that for Adams and Madison's notion of human nature and of virtue, so to speak, or the absence of the need for virtue, we don't have to transcend ourselves in order to have a good government. We don't have to become better people or have people in leadership positions that strain hard to become better people in order to still have a good government. Okay? And our government can survive quite well with people in charge who are not high-minded. So there's a strength in that. But the assumptions underlying it bother people. Okay? You know, and communitarians wonder, for instance, if those assumptions haven't sort of influenced our political culture and have actually put the seal of approval, the approval on self-interest as a virtue itself. Okay? So that, you know, they think, well, maybe American virtue is self-interest. Okay. Okay. Now, to sort of give you an idea of where Adams thought virtue was coming from, he says on page 34 on the right-hand column, here again is the emphasis on the virtue of the system. Okay? A constitution founded on these principles introduces knowledge among the people and inspires them with a conscious dignity, becoming freemen. A general emulation or imitation takes place, which causes good humor, sociability, good manners, and good morals to be general. So the freedom that the Constitution gives people and the responsibility it gives to them to vote, to pay attention, produces or has a tendency to produce, in his view, a certain type of people. Says that elevation of sentiment inspired by such a government makes the common people brave and enterprising. That ambition which is inspired by it makes them sober, industrious, and frugal. You will find among them some elegance, perhaps, but more solidity. A little pleasure, but a great deal of business. Some politeness, but more civility. Civility is less than politeness in his view. Right? Is doing what you need to do to make sure you don't have conflict with other people. If you compare such a country with the regions of domination, whether monarchical or aristocratical, you will fancy yourself in Arcadia or Elysium, okay? Ancient Greece. Isn't there some similarity here in his remarks with Pericles' remarks about the easygoing, democratic person? Okay? So, but again, notice here, these are the ways people sort of naturally behave in his view if they're given freedom. Okay? Not always, but, you know, in general, because Americans, you get the feeling here, Americans are going to be about doing business. They're going to be industrious. They're going to be working to make money for themselves and to take care of their families, produces certain qualities, generally speaking, in the ordinary citizen, which are good. All right? So government produces or gives people the opportunity to pursue happiness, right? Which they do, and in general, in his view, will be decent people, okay? And happiness, though, remains defined by the individual. Okay? If you don't want to make money, okay, if that's not what you want to do, that's okay too. You can pursue the life of the religious person, or you can pursue the life of the professor, or whatever it is. You don't have to all agree, right? Professors have never made any money either. They used to make less than they do now. Or the teacher would be an even better example. Nobody goes into teaching to make money. Okay? So you can decide. It's your path. And there's no one prescribed way or value that people need to uphold. So, virtues, I would argue, in the modern sense, these types of virtues here that he's talking about that sort of come about naturally through our lives are instrumental. And by that I mean virtues become a mean to ends rather than an end in and of themselves. Okay? Virtue becomes a means to an end instead of an end in itself. Okay. Which brings me to Ben Franklin's virtues. Okay? If you have them, pull them out. If you don't, I've got my list here, and I'll put them up on the board here as we talk about them. First of all, what did you think of them in general? Was this pretty good advice? Most of it? Pretty good advice about how to live your life? Are there any of these that would be bad for you? It's kind of hard to argue with these, isn't it? I mean, he tried, as I said before, to live them all first, but he failed. Okay? Couldn't do that. It's from his autobiography that he talks about this. And he says, there's just no way I could do all these at once. So then he tried to do one or two at a time. You know, for a certain period of time he would work on temperance, okay, and not drink as much, or just be moderate in his consumption of food and so forth. And then he'd move on to the next one and apparently, lighten up on the temperance. And I think that he thought that this generally made him a better person. Okay? Now, Franklin's method represents a belief in habituation, the idea that if you practice these things, even if you don't really have them in your heart at first, that by practicing them, you will internalize them, and they will make you better over time. They'll become a habit to you that you value. So you can go on this program even if you have absolutely no, real desire in your heart to have any of these qualities. You can just force yourself to practice them, at least one at a time. You will end up appreciating them, supposedly, and making them a part of yourself. Okay? In general, what do Ben Franklin's virtues reflect? What type of life do they reflect? What kind of attitude towards life do they reflect?
Moderation.
Okay, moderation is huge, right? One way or another, lots of them reflect moderation. Why is moderation good? Why is it good to be moderate?
It keeps you right in your step. It keeps you focused on the goal.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. Isn't it kind of ironic that Ben Franklin used his virtues on moderation?
Yes.
When he was such excess?
He was an excessive personality, and maybe maybe this is why he tried to come up with this scheme, because I'm sure throughout his life he was told that he needed to rein himself in. He was a person who drank too much, who smoked too much, who flirted with women, who liked parties. He was odd too, as you probably know. He was just a strange person, eccentric in a lot of ways. And eccentricity is a sort of excessiveness, where you can't stop yourself. He's famous for taking air baths, for being naked outdoors. So this was a figure of the Enlightenment who was not conventional at all. So yeah, it is somewhat ironic that he would come up with this list. And when he describes it in his autobiography, it's got an ironic tone to it. He's got a sense of humor. I mean, I think he took the project seriously, but then he did also have a sense of humor about it, and could laugh at himself, and he was pointing out his own weaknesses as he went through these different things. Yeah. Ben Franklin would not have made a good model of his own behavior. Yeah. And yet he was still a successful man, So a publisher and extensive writer, and of course very influential in the American founding. So he sort of breaks with that rule too, because he's implying with these virtues that if you want to be successful, you should practice these. These are what makes a person successful. That he managed, maybe because he was brilliant or in the right place at the right time. I don't think he was brilliant actually, but in the right place at the right time with some good ideas that were catching on anyway. He didn't have to conform to all these to be a success. Can you imagine now sending an ambassador to France or some other country, and he goes and has flirts with all the women at ambassadorial parties and so forth. Imagine how long that would last.
It would be such a relief.
Huh?
It would be such a relief from that.
How they usually go, it would be so nice to actually have somebody that actually had a personality. Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. We have high standards now, where the do kind of tend to block out individuality, And we have a very low level of tolerance as a society for such eccentricities at this point in time. So I don't think Ben Franklin would be taken seriously now, and that's a funny thought to have, isn't it? Okay, so we talked about moderation and how that, and you're right that being moderate in a lot of things. Eating, drinking, and your relationships and behavior and so forth should allow you to focus more on your goals, not get sidetracked by your desires, by your bad habits, and to keep you on track. Okay? So certainly these virtues, all of them, are really aimed at keeping a person focused on what's really important to them. Okay? So he talks about temperance. Okay? No excessive drinking, eating, smoking, whatever. Order. Frugality, which is not wasting money. Okay? Industry. Not being lazy, keeping yourself working. Moderation itself. Okay? Tranquility. Being at ease, being at ease with oneself, not getting overly excited and stimulated, and which can lead you off track. Machiavelli had similar advice. You do not want to get angry, frustrated, passionate about things, because those feelings will divert you from your purpose and make you less calculating. Okay? And chastity. That was really something that he didn't have much success with. But it means abstaining from sex, right? At least with somebody other than your spouse, and maybe even with your spouse, if the idea is that you shouldn't focus upon that excessively, okay? But certainly if you're not married, you should be able to keep it to yourself. So those are half of the virtues, actually. And we could sum them all up as self-control, which is why usually said moderation, same sort of thing. Self-control. All right? Now here's the other one. All right, we have silence. This is a good one to know and to practice. If you don't have something good to say, they say don't say anything at all, right? My mom brought me up to, I don't always follow that, but she always said, you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? Just keep your mouth shut. And also, lots of times, if you really don't know what's going on, the best thing to do is to keep your mouth shut too, because then people are left to wonder whether you know or not. Sometimes the silent person is the one that looks the most intelligent because everybody else is flapping their mouth and making it very clear that they don't know what's going on. So being able to not make noise, resolution, to be decisive, to do what you say you're going to do. Sincerity. To be sincere means to tell the truth, to be forthright up front with a person. He says no hurtful deceit. Do not deceive people, especially for hurtful reasons. Justice. And he defines justice as fulfilling one's obligations. Okay? Fulfilling one's obligations. No doubt both to the state, that is the laws, and also to each other in our contracts and our agreements that we have with each other. Okay? Cleanliness. You ever thought of cleanliness as a virtue? Why would cleanliness be at all really important as a virtue?
Reflects other things about your personality. Don't pay much attention to anything else that you can keep yourself clean.
It reflects upon who you are as a person, right? It says, I don't care about myself, which means maybe I don't care about others either. It just sends the wrong message to people. And finally, humility. Now, this was something that Franklin felt very deeply about. He could not always control himself lots of times because he was very, I think, proud of himself, actually, and very good at conversation. I had a lot of very neat ideas. And so humility wouldn't have been easy for him, but he was still a big fan of trying to practice it. Okay? And I had I brought in this book because I have a quote from Ben Franklin, from a letter from Franklin to his daughter, and giving her advice that reflects this virtue of humility. This writer, John West, says, in later years, Franklin became even more circumspect in advancing his own opinions. Okay? He would say what he thought one-on-one or in a small group of people, but in public he was actually careful about speaking his opinions. And to this tentative manner of speaking, Franklin attributed much of the respect with which he was accorded. He retained, he said, only the habit of expressing myself in terms of modest diffidence. This habit, I believe, has been of great advantage to me when I have had occasion to inculcate my opinions and persuade men into measures that I have been from time to time engaged in promoting. Okay? So, he says, this is one of the most explicit passages in which Franklin spoke of the necessity of deception in public discourse. But there are others where the same point is conveyed more subtly, as when he cautioned his daughter in a letter after she apparently entertained thoughts of staying away from church in 1764. Franklin was not a Christian in any traditional sense of the word, and he understood that there was a big difference between him and the prevailing community opinion on religion, and he knew that if he was to be effective as an opinion leader and as a leader, he needed to not draw great attention to that.
Well, these are really just Christian values of success in replacing God. I mean, isn't that right? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, none of these would in any way contradict Christian values, okay, necessarily. Some of them aren't hardly relevant, like cleanliness and probably frugality. But I mean, yeah, and generally none of these would contradict Christian values, and some of them reflect directly Christian values. But Christian values and in general moral values often do overlap. There's a lot of the religion, as well as Judaism and Islam, that overlap with just basic good sense, moral values. Okay? But yeah, you can't say though that, well, Franklin was stealing from everything. He thought that these just made rational sense. Okay? But notice that nowhere in here is there love of God. Okay, so that's a Christian or religious value that's absent.
I think the difference that these are values that are motivated by self-interest, whereas for a Christian these would be valued as a result of the interest in pleasing God. So.
Yep, there's a big difference too between self-interest and the desire to please God. Frugality doesn't fit because actually it may be that God requires you to give everything you have away. To be actually what you might say foolish about your money in the sense of not keeping enough for yourself. Frugality is saving and spending your money wisely so that you do not lose too much.
So from a modern perspective, do they see self-interest? They just see that as part of life. They don't see it as a virtue. They don't see it as something you want. They just see it as something you have to deal with.
Right. Self-interest is not a virtue itself, but it does, in their view, produce good things. If you let it, and this may or may not be true, but if you let it be free, for the most part, people are going to generally do good things with it. Making money is not a bad thing, and the more people who are free to make money, the better off everybody will be. So the outcome is good. Okay? But yeah, self-interest itself is neither a virtue or a vice. It's just a reality of the personality. Sometimes it seems as though in some of the writings, self-interest usurps the notion of virtue to such an extent. A critic might say self-interest has become a virtue. And there are certain writings. I mean, Ayn Rand is a good example of a contemporary writer who elevates self-interest itself to a virtue. It's the noble quality of a person to have and acknowledge their self-interest. I don't think the founders go that far, but they assume that and they think that there's nothing terribly wrong with it. If you give people the freedom, they will, they will pursue their self-interest, but that doesn't have to hurt anybody else in the process. If everybody's industrious, everybody will be better off, and everybody has a incentive to protect their own property, their own family, and so forth. And in the process of doing that, through their participation in government, they will be protecting everybody else. Because you can't have it just for yourself. You can't have property rights just for yourself. In a system like this, you've got to be willing to let everybody else have it too. Okay, but we found that then the charity is missing from this list, right? Okay, frugality is there, but not charity, and that's a Christian value that's absent. So, before I forget, let me read you what Franklin counseled his daughter. Yeah. Franklin counseled her against such a move, staying away from church, on grounds of prudence, not on piety. Quote, "You know I have many enemies. It is therefore the more necessary for you to be extremely circumspect in all your behavior, that no advantage may be given to their malevolence, which is hatred. Go constantly to church, whoever preaches. In other words, those who seek the confidence of the public must be willing to accommodate the public's prejudices. Okay? So go to church, but go to church because this way you will not offend anybody. And he was sensitive to that, not wishing to offend people. Okay? Because the vast majority of people were Christians, and pretty serious Christians, and would not at all like some of Franklin's ideas. Thomas Paine's a good example of somebody who voiced the sort of anti-Christian, anti-traditional point of view, a founding figure, but one that was disgraced and ostracized because he was too open about his views. So he ended up not being a very popular man at all. So Franklin knew something about what it takes to get along. Okay? And that's what how I would, I guess, classify these. These are virtues about getting along, the social virtues. And they don't require a feeling of brotherliness, of friendship towards people. They require certain behavior, okay? A frame of mind, certainly, but certain behavior out of people. You can practice justice if it means obeying agreements and contracts, okay, without liking a person or even genuinely wanting to be fair to them. But you practice it because you realize that if you want to stay in business, you can't lie to people. You can't have a good, thriving business if you get a reputation for lying and being unjust to people. So it makes sense to be just, okay? And sincerity, again, you don't want to deceive people. You get a reputation for that. You want a reputation for resolution, decisiveness, so that people can count on you doing what you say you're going to do. Again, it's very good for the businessman or for anybody who wants to have a stable position in their society to do what they say they're going to do, so that you can count on them. But again, you don't have to be a resolute person in the sense of finding that to be a virtuous quality that is noble, but you have to realize the practicality of conforming to that, to behaving in that way if you want to be successful. Okay? Humility, again, we just talked about that. It means knowing that if you don't act in a humble way, you're going to offend people and they won't listen to you anymore. Okay? That's different from true humility, say, like in the Christian sense, where, you have a humbleness of heart based upon God's greatness and your lowliness. Okay? So it's based on prudence. All right? How many of you, when you were in school, since you're all pretty smart people here, how many of you decided to downplay some area in which you did well because you didn't want to be disliked by your fellow students? Right? Unfortunately, that happens a lot, and it's partly a result of the type of culture that we live in, that if you display your intelligence too much, or your talent in athletics, or whatever it is, somebody's likely to take offense and try to get you, right? Somehow insult you or put you down or worse. So people learn how to, mollify people somehow, okay? Either by downplaying their talents, which is unfortunate, or by making sure that they develop the social skills to make other people feel welcome and accepted, okay? Which is a better way to handle that situation. Okay. Let's see. Just a little bit more on Franklin. He's fun. It says here, when Franklin drafted a plan for the education of youth, he noted that the study of history will, quote, afford frequent opportunities of showing the mischiefs of superstition and the excellency of the Christian religion above all others, ancient and modern. To be sure, Franklin himself rarely attended services, and his own statements of religious belief, when he made them, were not at all evangelical, ranging from Unitarian to polytheistic. Boy, that's a big range, isn't it? In other words, he was just a speculator. Regardless of his private theology, however, Franklin usually appeared in public as a sincere believer in God. On occasion, he could even rise to a kind of spiritual grandeur, as with his remarkable speech at the Constitutional Convention advocating prayers to open the daily sessions. Okay. So, I do this on Franklin to make it very clear the difference between the ancient and the modern notions of virtue. And you've also made a good point, but you can also contrast it with the Christian or other religious notions of virtue, okay? Because they do not require you to change inwardly as much as to change outward habits, and the reason for changing is to be more effective, okay? To be more effective socially, to be more effective in business. So what we don't see there is as important as what we do see there. Okay? We talked about how charity is absent, okay? And love of God is absent. All right? Is there anything else that you can think of that you don't see here that you might see in a previous listing of virtues? Now, I wanted to leave you with some thoughts from Tocqueville, because Tocqueville goes back and forth between admiring the older aristocratic values and admiring America's more middle-class values, or what came to be called the bourgeois values. Okay? Franklin's are the bourgeois values, middle-class values. Okay? And Tocqueville realizes in the 19th century, he's writing prior to the Civil War, he realizes that in a lot of ways the common man is going to be way better off in a place like America than he would ever be in old Europe, where the aristocracy reigns supreme. Okay? But yet they lose something too, and so he laments the loss. And the loss really amounts to the loss of things like valuing honor, beauty, love of God, courage, those things that we've just listed here. Okay? Those are lost in a more democratic environment. He says, on page 42, down at the bottom, I admit that in a democratic state, thus constituted, society will not be stationary, but the impulses of the social body may be regulated and directed forward. If there be less splendor than in the halls of an aristocracy, the contrast of misery will be less frequent also. The pleasures of enjoyment may be less excessive, but those of comfort will be more general. The sciences will be less perfectly cultivated. That actually turned out to be untrue, right? Because they became profitable. But ignorance will be less common. The impetuosity of the feelings will be repressed, and the habits of the nation softened. There will be more vices and fewer crimes. Okay? Fewer crimes because more people will be satisfied economically. Okay? But more vices precisely because more people have the resources to enjoy the vices, okay? And the freedom to do that. One more paragraph and then I'll let you go. In the absence of enthusiasm and of an ardent faith, great sacrifices may be obtained from the members of a commonwealth by an appeal to their understandings and their experience. Each individual will feel the same necessity for uniting with his fellow citizens to protect his own weakness, as he knows that if they are to assist, he must cooperate. He will readily perceive that his personal interest is identified with the interest of the community. Okay? So Tocqueville he nailed it. Okay? The difference between the ancient and the aristocratic notion of virtue and the modern liberal notion of virtue. Okay? You cooperate with your fellow citizens because you perceive it as in your personal interest to identify with the interest of the community. Okay? The moral problem, of course, with that, and works quite well, but the moral problem that might be perceived is that what if something isn't? What if something that will benefit you greatly isn't in the interest of the community? What other reason do you have to not do it? Okay? All right. So I still have stuff to do with this particular unit for our next week. So we'll finish up Tocqueville and talk a little bit about Danielle Allen before we move into the next set of readings.